let's talk about the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is, well, edited by Christopher Tolkien. Relevant point. This is, if you like, the prequel to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It was conceived by Tolkien in publication terms originally in the 30s. He'd started writing large parts of it in the First World War in 1916 onwards. He drafted it before he wrote either The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, and then his idea for follow-up to The Hobbit was this plus The Lord of the Rings. You know, this idea of a two-part legendarium, which The Hobbit was a kind of introduction to. And his publishers didn't want that at the time, and so he focused on Lord of the Rings. When he finished Lord of the Rings, he redrafted and expanded most of the Silmarillion, and we have now then a version of the Silmarillion which is which was left unfinished and with contradictions at his death, because after the late 50s he didn't because there's also two novel fragments from the mid to late 50s he didn't get far into or finish, but after that he didn't actually write narrative strictly. He wrote chunks of narrative, but he mostly was writing them only as micro responses or explanations of things when he was trying to work out etymology and how certain very specific problems fit together. So this was also the last version of the Silmarillion was pretty much the last large-scale writing he did, albeit it was revision and expansion. This version is by Tolkien, but it is definitely edited by his son, and when you read History of Middle-earth, you'll occasionally pick up Christopher talking about texts and sources of this, saying, perhaps I should have done this. In one case, he actually says, I actually now think I over-edited on this point. Generally, that does not mean he wrote loads of it. There are a couple of tiny bits of joining text, but he made key decisions about how things came together based on contradictions where it just wouldn't make a coherent narrative otherwise. This is mostly true in the last three chapters, which Tolkien never revised from the 30s, never meaningfully revised, I should say. Now, this is a book that alienates people, I think, who like Lord of the Rings. Even people who love Lord of the Rings, which is not the hardest book ever, don't let anyone tell you that, but it's not a simple book, it's not a kid's book, it requires attention, it demands effort. But Lord of the Rings is a novel. It's a story, an epic story of friends going on an adventure, and they have these objectives and they have this kind of conversation, and you get a lot of environmentals about what they're experiencing, and lots of fairly typical and traditional English novel insight into their characters. And then this is completely different. In that time were made those things that afterwards were most renowned of all the works of the elves. Arath at Larfeinil, the White Lady of the Noldor, daughter of Fingolfin, dwelt in Nevrast with Turgon her brother, and she went with him to the hidden kingdom. Now to all is said concerning the manner of the earth and its rulers in the beginning of days, and ere the world became such as the children of Ilúvatar have known it. 3 randomly chosen sentences, not unrepresentative of style and of distance. There is often a non-novelistic distance between Tolkien in this and the reader. And this is because this isn't a novel. It is prose, on the whole. It is fiction, but it is not a novel. And that's because it's a saga. It's at points explicitly, in one case, Turin and Turambar very explicitly based on an Icelandic saga. But it's generally speaking, it's meant to be the saga mythology prior to the Arthuriad equivalent, I guess, of Lord of the Rings. It's meant to be an epic prehistory, or early, pseudo micro early history that introduces this era, which you then read elsewhere. And they're equally important. To say it merely introduces it is to do it down, but that's the point. It serves that function. Lord of the Rings serves the other function. This is the story of the elves and of the mythic days. Lord of the Rings is the story of the halflings and the men, and the time where these days of legend were turning into our days, and they end by turning into our days. One reason Tolkien abandoned The New Shadow, the very, very brief but fascinating sequel to Lord of the Rings, implicitly Christopher Tolkien thinks is because his conception had ended, of this epic age becoming like our age. This is the epic age. It also, as a book, contains not just the kind of the very early days, but also the story of Atlantis in Middle Earth terms, and a summary of the whole story of the Rings of Power, the 9, the 7, the 3, and the 1, and how they proceed from the Second Age of Middle Earth stuff, like the period between the early Elfin stuff and the later Lord of the Ringsy stuff, and how they go through that, and then how they turn into what we see in Lord of the Rings, and then the end of the story. So you actually get, without every moment having an equivalent section, you kind of get a history that's meant to go from the beginning of the world to the end of Lord of the Rings in here as well. And then Lord of the Rings is a particularly detailed story, as is The Hobbit, of the events in that period. So if you come here thinking this is a novel, you'll be disappointed. But if you don't, if you come prepared for a text that's more like a mixture of the Bible and Greek myths and Icelandic sagas, and it's in that tone, in that mode, then you will, I think, find this to be an excellent book. It's only aged well on me. Last year I managed to read all of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. This I read with my reading group on my Discord, but this one I had read twice before, and I had always liked it, but I think this is one where it went from being like, oh yes, I definitely like that, to, oh no, this is as good as Lord of the Rings, basically. It's different. It's not the same thing, but it's as good in terms of my enjoyment of it, or nearly as good, perhaps I should say. The one flaw, and I'll put it this way, I think this is simple enough. There are things which are challenges. There's lots of names. This was the biggest thing. I think the single biggest complaint in our reading group was people being like, I need to keep up with all the names. It's quite tough. You get in the back of your book, you get lists of names, a very long list of index of names is itself, 50 pages. You have family trees, which is the same as in Lord of the Rings. You have obviously some family trees there too, and that's very useful for remembering certain things, certain relations, particularly more among men than among elves. I think many people will probably be like, oh, if I only have to memorise this number of Noldor elves, that I'll be fine. But there are so many groups that you need to have a look at that, you can see there are 4 family trees plus an elf tribal tree for a reason. So there's that. I think the style is one, it's very good writing. It's incredibly efficient, incredibly powerful, and I talked about this at length at many points in my Silmarillion chat series, which is spoiler discussions. Last of all, someone stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield and wielded an axe two-handed, and it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard until it withered, and each time that he slew he cried, Aure en Toluva, day shall come again. 70 times he uttered that cry. This kind of very efficient, epic bit of storytelling about this character. Poetic. Often high use of assonance and alliteration to create poetic effects as you're reading, and the rhythm and sentences. This design was slow to ripen and was never wholly achieved, for men, it is said, were at first very few in number, whereas Morgoth grew afraid of the growing power and union of the Eldar and came back to Angband, leaving behind at that time but few servants and those of less might and cunning. That's a very pedestrian sentence, but not for Tolkien. It's rhythmic, it's powerful. You can more or less flick through to anything and say, oh, that's a good sentence, even though it's not even a very beautiful one. It just works really well, and there are many beautiful sentences in this, if that's what you're into. This is the story ultimately of God creates the world, Eru Ilúvatar, Tolkien's god in Middle Earth, and the archangels go around creating stuff, But a flaw comes into this, which is one of the archangels who rebels, and he seeks to destroy stuff, and he corrupts the hearts of, or he finds corruptible the hearts of God's two kindred of children, the elves and the men, and he, particularly because this story about the elves, he uses the elves' pride. Not really he understands his own actions, but he uses the elves' pride to try to destroy them. And the elves who have gone, so some elves stay behind in Middle-earth, but the elves who have gone to the Blessed Land to live with the archangels come back in vengeance to take back something they believe is theirs. The Silmarillion, these jewels called the Silmarils. And so you have this epic scope, you have this beautiful writing, you have this this enormous cast of thousands, you have many stories within it, and not just beautifully but also efficiently and structurally effectively Tolkien tells the story. I mean, it's one of the most impressive, especially because you're talking about a book that's including the extra chapters that aren't even about that, the Calabeth and the Rings of Power and the Third Age. You've got like 300 pages in which he tells this epic story much more efficiently than, this is the same thing with Lord of the Rings. It's a 1,000 or 1,100 page book that does in that space what many people spend 14 books writing. It's incredibly efficient. The character work is actually, of all things, the most surprising, because this is a thing where you have events that happen decades apart, you don't get lots of time with characters, but there is a fairly large core cast, amongst the elves particularly, but also with key men, Beren and Turin, most obviously Eärendil and Elwing as well, who are well developed. You know who they are. I mean, Elwing are half elven, but anyway, characters, you know who they are. You know the different layers to their characters. You see their different experiences, but yeah, it's not the same thing as the character development in a novel. But there is a character development that has clear arcs, and in some cases development, and in other cases, in most cases, fulfillment. The idea that there is something, and there's something in that character which has to come to fulfillment through the events. It's not so much that they go from being like, my problem was that I didn't respect authority, but now I do, but in a way that I can still challenge it. Or I didn't believe in myself to succeed because people used to put me down, but now I do. Not those kinds of character development arcs, but rather this character has this in them, or this is their native character. Occasionally there's something more complex, such as this character is self-destructive but heroic, or this character is actually a good guy but is caught up in something very bad. There's surprising twists on this. Tolkien is subtle. He is not simply writing, this is the simple heroic trope of this. There's some ironies actually in terms of thinking about Moorcock's generally badly misconceived criticisms of Tolkien. There's a few things here which speak to that. I mean, character development in Lord of the Rings alone answers it, but the fact that Moorcock is a lot more likely to have a simple and open character development, whereas Tolkien is more likely to have a ambiguous and ambivalent one, in a way that is surprising to us. And I think he does this very well here in a few instances. Not with every character, but in a few instances. And what happens to certain characters and how they develop is really fascinating. Both good guys and bad guys. You know, how you see them develop here and in other books in the Legendarium. The Quenta Silmarillion, which is the heart of this, along with the creation myth stuff at the start, that's the guts of this. That is essentially the novel. It's not a novel, but that's the novel here. You know, that is just over 200 pages, and that is one of the best things that Tolkien wrote. It is, along with Lord of the Rings, for me, my favourite thing. The other things in here are also the Ainulin Dale and the Vala Quenta, which are the mythic prehistory of everyone creating the world by God and the archangels creating the world, and then a list of the archangels and their angel servants. That mostly really connects to the Quenta, but it is the bit that is most about the gods, as it were, whereas the Quenta is mostly about the elves. A Calabeth is the story of the men who the gods choose to bless, the archangels choose to bless, and they get their own island, and they can't come to the Blessed Land because they're men, and their fate is not there. There's a whole thing. This comes up in Lord of the Rings, of course, but they can see it, and this is about faith and tragedy and rebellion, and it's an explanation of Atlantis. It's in the background of why Elendil and his sons come to Middle Earth, and Akalabeth is you can see. In terms of, I haven't watched it, so I often no comment on the programme itself, but the Rings of Power development, the idea they're interested in Numenor, they're right to be. They don't have the rights to this book, alas, for that purpose. But you look at the Akalabeth, and there is a story of, and it's very much, in this case, it's very much it's not a Genesis Bible story, but a history of Israel Bible story, if you take the reference. Of this quite gritty and bloody and difficult time in human history, marked by relationships with gods and demons and the rest of it. And it's very, very powerful, and could make on its own a very good TV series without any faffing around from anything else. And then of the Rings of Power in the Third Age is an overview, which is it does include the Akalabeth actually, but it's all about the various kind of events that lead to the end of the Mythic Age, i.e. the destruction of the Elven Rings, which are the last thing that are keeping the Eldar in the world, able to preserve things. That's the point of them. And so in that sense, it's incidental, but it's providential too, because it's also, we see in Lord of the Rings the time where humans finally take their place as the key race of Middle-earth, which was always the plan. The assumption was that, at least it seems to have always been the plan, because the Eldar were always assumed to be going to the Blessed Land to live forever there, where men would rule in Middle-earth, in mortal Middle-earth. And of the Rings of Power in the Third Age has loads of interesting details. It's much the least important of these in terms of artistic effect. It's still very nice. It still has some very good moments. It's where we get some of the best accounts of some things that we know from elsewhere, to do with the Last Alliance, for instance, things like that. But generally speaking, it's the least exciting. The Akalabeth does naturally follow in away from the Quenta, but it's also somewhat detached. It's not a continuous history at that point. The guts of this is the Quenta. It is beautifully formed. The character work is great, as I say. There are the last couple of chapters, more particularly by that I mean chapter 22 and chapter 23 out of the 24 chapters, are obviously underdeveloped. Compared to others which have nearly 30 pages, they have 11 pages and 8 pages respectively, and they are central to the end of the First Age, and essentially where Tolkien had with all the rest got to the point of revising and expanding. He didn't get to that point with that. There aren't completely coherent narratives about how certain things happen, particularly with Doriath, which is where Chris Tolkien says he had to intervene a bit, he felt, and then he later regrets it. You get some good, satisfying stuff to do with characters you followed, but it is suddenly, and you also get the explanation in that area of who this Glorfindel fellow is who's in Lord of the Rings, but it is quite sudden, and it then, however, ends with the final chapter very powerfully. By the way, it's not a spoiler to say everything goes wrong for these elves in Middle-earth, because you're told it's going to the whole time, and the chapter titles are on a list at the start. Sagas are not about surprise. They're about the development of theme and the fulfilment of purpose and destiny. So yeah, do I recommend the Silmarillion? Well, I mean, unreservedly, yes. I mean, as a saga, not as a novel, but as a saga, this is one of the best you'll ever read. I think specifically to Tolkien fans, you should read it, but you should come into it knowing that it is not what you've read in Lord of the Rings, and that it is meant to... It's, in a sense, part of a multimedia project. It's not simply, this guy's written a bunch of novels in an epic series that I'm going to read. He's not Robin Hobb, he's not, Robert Jordan. This is a different thing, a different form for a different purpose. And it's irreplaceable to us and incredibly precious to us that Chris Tolkien put it together. With Guy Gavriel Kay as well, in fact. Anyway, tell me your experiences of the Silmarillion in the comments, and I will see you next time.